hurricane season was thankfully quiet in mid-September 2024 for the suncoast of Florida, a region that stretches roughly from Tampa down to Naples. After a direct hit by Hurricane Ian in 2022, which devastated much of the region, 2023 and most of 2024 had been thankfully quiet for the region. In 2023, Hurricane Idalia grazed the suncoast, and same thing for August of 2024 when Hurricane Debby swung by. However, as September turned into October, the hurricane season began to truly wreak havoc on this part of Florida. Although the majority of coverage on Hurricane Helene rightfully focuses on the damage that it caused in Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, Hurricane Helene undoubtedly had an effect on the Gulf Coast of Florida, especially in Pinellas County, where significant wind and significant storm surge had affected the area in western Tampa Bay. However, that would prove to be the prelude to the next big one after Hurricane Ian, because although we thought we had escaped the worst of the hurricane season, we were due for another one. Hurricane Milton was a weird storm. Unlike most Atlantic hurricanes, which tend to move off the coast of Africa as tropical waves turn into tropical depressions across the Atlantic and turn into tropical storms and hurricanes as they reach the Caribbean and eventually the United States, Hurricane Milton developed in the southwest Gulf of Mexico, west of the Yucatan Peninsula. Weirdly enough, a tropical storm in the Pacific Ocean crossed Mexico and merged with a low pressure front in the area to form what would become the fourth most intense Atlantic hurricane on record. Unlike most natural disasters in North America, like flash flooding, tornadoes, earthquakes, we tend to have a fairly decent idea when hurricanes are going to strike a place and generally its path. However, there is a lot of uncertainty when it comes to hurricane models, and it was no different than Hurricane Milton. Hurricane Milton's path was estimated to roughly stretch from Fort Myers in the south to north of Tampa Bay, a path similar to Hurricane Idalia and Helene. And when people see a path of a hurricane and they see that map, they typically imagine that's the general path of the hurricane, that red area. However, that's just where the eye could be. So there is a tremendous level of uncertainty in terms of whether you're just going to get grazed by the hurricane or whether the eye is going to roll directly over you. As Milton began to move east across the Gulf of Mexico, it became very clear that Port Charlotte, my home and the home of Tampa Bay Rays spring training, would receive at least some of the impact from this storm. Even for storms with minimal damage to Port Charlotte like Debby and Helene, I tend to put my storm shutters up pretty early, as the last thing you want to do when a storm is bearing down on you is to be putting up sharp metal shutters. Like, the last thing you want is to have flying metal going towards you in any way, shape, or form. And so although the majority of the models had the eye going towards Tampa, hurricanes are capable of just these remarkable turns that seem to occur for no reason at all. So as Milton is moving across, I have my shutters up, and even though most of the models had Hurricane Milton moving towards Tampa Bay, my gut was telling me that something was going to happen where that storm was going to turn and we would get potentially another big one on the scale of Ian. And your gut is often right, because Milton began to make a southward turn towards Port Charlotte, and that's when things began to get a little bit crazy. Because at 9 p.m. on October 8th, 2024, I got my notice to evacuate my hurricane zone in Port Charlotte. Now, thankfully, I had already kind of kept a hotel room in Miami reserved in the event that I need to evacuate. And for those who don't live in Florida, that might sound weird evacuating further south, but for a storm that's moving northeast in the direction Milton was, Miami was actually a pretty safe direction to go to. But got that evacuation notice, and I started to make my way across the Everglades towards Miami, and had the Weather Channel open basically the whole time because I just wanted to have an idea of where the storm might hit and just kind of have an idea, like, what am I coming home to? And thankfully, Jim Cantori, the famous Weather Channel meteorologist, was up in Sarasota. And it does not take a meteorology degree to know that Jim Cantori is going to likely the place that's going to get the worst of a hurricane. But seemingly in like 5 minutes, Jim had made the journey that's typically 45 minutes to an hour from Sarasota to this newly built Sunseeker Resort in Port Charlotte. The Sunseeker is about 5 minutes from my house, and I was like, okay, that's a signal of a shift.
But we will see a landfall likely in the next couple of hours or so, 2 to 3 hours. We'll see. But I'm in Charlotte Harbor right now, literally standing in Charlotte Harbor, which has taken over the parking area here at the Sunseeker in Port Charlotte.
And so I was like, all right, thank goodness I made a plan to evacuate, because I do not want to be 5 minutes away from Jim Cantore when a hurricane is coming. The last thing I was thinking about was baseball. Apart from having brought my PlayStation so I could play a little bit of MLB The Show at my hotel and just kind of pass the time and keep my eyes off of the Weather Channel and my Ring cameras, really wasn't focused that much about baseball, let alone Tropicana Field. If there was a facility that Rays fans were worried about in Hurricane Milton, it was this, Charlotte Sports Park. So this is the Rays spring training facility, which during Hurricane Ian was damaged so badly that 2023 spring training had to be moved to the Wide World of Sports complex in Orlando, as well as Tropicana Field. Now, it tends to vary team by team, but spring training facilities are massively important to Major League Baseball teams. They often act as the headquarters or the secondary headquarters for any Major League Baseball team. They often are the main place where players rehab from injuries. It's often the first place in the United States that Latin American prospects go to play in the complex leagues. Some Major League Baseball teams even have their own single A teams play out of their spring training facilities. And so having to move your operation even once out of a spring training facility is a massive logistical burden on any Major League Baseball team, let alone having to move it twice in 3 years. There was significant reason to be fearful that this facility here, Charlotte Sports Park, would be definitely affected, if not put out of commission again after Hurricane Milton began to move southwards. And plus, Tropicana Field had been around for 39 years. There's no reason to be worried about the trop during Hurricane Milton. It just wasn't even something I think most Rays fans were worried about. People were justifiably more focused on the safety of themselves and their loved ones. Plus, plenty of hurricanes had moved through, and there was just no reason for many people to be worried about Tropicana Field. In fact, Tropicana Field had actually served as a hurricane refuge for other Major League Baseball teams. Most recently, the 2017 Houston Astros, who used Tropicana Field in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, which devastated Houston. So it was really just not much of a mental factor for most Major League Baseball fans, let alone Tampa Bay Rays fans, that the Trop would be damaged. However, Hurricane Milton proved to be the exception. As I was watching the Weather Channel, the footage of news reporters on the ground and meteorologists on the ground cut to a shot of a building with no roof.
That breaking news, Hurricane Milton has made landfall, and it has made a dent. Look at this. We're taking a live look now at Tropicana Field. The roof ripped right off of the stadium there.
It was Tropicana Field. The most important year in the history of the Tampa Bay Rays began the moment that footage began to air of the tattered roof at Tropicana Field fluttering in the wind. If you don't count the Montreal Expos becoming the Washington Nationals, the Tampa Bay Rays are tied for the second newest team in MLB history, and they have packed more winning and more significant change in that time than any other team in MLB history. From radical 90s uniforms that might be the greatest threads in baseball history, to focus group and corporately tested uniforms, from a miscast and overspent group of old players and has-beens, to an assembly line of young, exciting players that won consistently. Tropicana Field played host to all of that. It was the only backdrop that the Tampa Bay Rays had had for their entire history, and it was all gone. On October 9th, when that footage aired of the roof, it was abundantly clear that Tropicana Field would be out of commission for at least a year, which was not good, as the Tampa Bay Rays had made, at best, glacial progress with local government in the Tampa Bay area at replacing the almost 4-decade-old Tropicana Field. To understand how we got here to where Major League Baseball's most consistent winner is left scrambling, searching for a home with mere months before first pitch, we have to go back because the story of how the Rays got here does not start in 2024. It doesn't start in 2010. It doesn't start all the way back in 1998. It starts in the 1500s because the understanding of Florida's history being the Seminoles, orange juice, air conditioning, and Disneyland is woefully inadequate. Because to understand how we got here, we have to talk about dead conquistadors, cigars, and one of the world's greatest real estate scams. Certain places on Earth were almost guaranteed to become large centers of human population by virtue of geography alone. Things like large natural harbors, river junctions, fertile soil, and protection from natural disasters make certain places highly advantageous for humans to congregate. New York with its deep natural harbor, New Orleans with its command of the Mississippi River, and Pittsburgh with its river junctions, these places were almost guaranteed to become centers of human culture, trade, and government. Tampa Bay is not one of those places. Tampa Bay was not especially deep until dredging work was done later on after human habitation, and the large just amount of days where the weather is very hot and very humid make it extremely difficult for dense human habitation until really the 1950s with the advent of air conditioning. In fact, over the course of this area's history, it was not a guarantee that Tampa Bay would host the largest city on the Gulf Coast. I'm here at Ponce de Leon Park, and behind me is the Charlotte Harbor Estuary, which is notably not in Tampa Bay. The Charlotte Harbor Estuary forms a bay roughly in similar size and natural depth to Tampa Bay. It's protected by a series of barrier islands which shield it from the rough seas and hurricanes that tend to batter the Gulf Coast of Florida, and this bay has formed a fascinating ecosystem for millions of years, which has supported large-scale human habitation. For millennia prior to European contact, as well as centuries after, this area was inhabited and ruled by the Calusa people. The Calusa people are fascinating in that they are one of the most highly developed civilizations in human history to have almost no reliance on large-scale settled agriculture, unlike their contemporaries in the Americas that relied on the Three Sisters, or Europe, Asia, and Africa with their dominance in grain crops. The Calusa people were a highly maritime-based civilization, and they achieved a level of development of this type of civilization that we have hardly ever seen. The Calusa built massive shell mounds and fisheries, their own system of canals and drainage to mold the environment to their needs. And although we don't have written records from the Calusa, archaeological findings have given us a glimpse into a society with incredible art, complex religious beliefs, and an astoundingly large trade network, with archaeological evidence that suggests that Calusa people had contact with peoples as far away as Missouri. The combination of the Calusa's development along with the inhospitable climate made this area an incredibly difficult area for European colonizers to effectively subjugate. Although we associate South Florida's struggle for independence with the Seminole tribes who fought the United States as well as the British and Spanish later on, it's arguable that some of the most effective anti-colonial resistance in the United States pre-American independence happened here in Southwest Florida. The Calusa were renowned for their abilities in combat and their fierce desire to maintain their sovereignty. The Spanish accounts of the day on first contact with the Calusa, typically highly dismissive of indigenous peoples and their cultures, maintained almost a begrudging respect for the Calusa people and their ability to keep the conquistadors at an arm's length. Despite Spain's political maneuvering, attempts at colonization, and other maneuvers, including the first documented interracial marriage in what is now the United States occurring to try and unify the Spanish and the Calusa, attempts by the conquistadors to bring the Calusa under their control were largely unsuccessful. The Calusa's ability to fight off the Spanish militarily, as well as the hot and humid climate, largely led to a disinterest in the area by Spain. And this was not for a lack of trying. See, this area was very, very important for Spain's colonial project. Spain had a number of colonial possessions in the Caribbean, like Cuba, San Domingo, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as well as possessions in South America, as well as possessions in the North American continent, like St. Augustine, Florida, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and what would now exist as Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexico. This was a very important way station for trade, as Key West was a nice way station, but it wasn't big enough for a large-scale settlement on the scale of St. Augustine, Florida. Arguably the breaking point for Spain in its attempts to colonize Southwest Florida occurred when the world's dumbest wellness influencer attempted to create a colony in Charlotte Harbor. Ponce de Leon Park, the namesake of this park, Ponce de Leon, sailed into Charlotte Harbor in 1521 with 200 men in an attempt to create a settlement. Now, it's very likely that the aim for this would have been very likely to create a Western St. Augustine, and those dreams were dashed the moment they left their boats. The Calusa, well aware of the Conquistadors' arrival time into their home, came out and immediately started attacking the Conquistadors with arrows that were poisoned from poisonous tree sap. Yes, we are America's Australia. We have trees here that have poison sap. And our boy Ponce de Leon here, yeah, he didn't find the Fountain of Youth in time. One of those poison arrows struck him and eventually poisoned him so badly that the expedition had to be abandoned. And Ponce de Leon, on the way back to Cuba, died. Yeah. He got a little bit of a taste of his own medicine. I'm not a huge fan of Ponce de Leon, but I find his death very, very funny. After Ponce de Leon's disastrous expedition into Charlotte Harbor in 1521, the colonial efforts for Spain made a decisive turn towards the north, towards Tampa Bay. Panfilo de Narvaez, as well as Hernan de Soto, made attempts and inroads into Tampa Bay after that 1521 de Leon expedition and found much greater military success. They were able to make much better inroads in with Tampa Bay. But Spain ultimately began to lose interest in Tampa Bay. There was a significant lack of precious metals that Spain was on the hunt for, like gold and silver, as well as the missionary efforts that had disastrously failed in Charlotte Harbor, as you can imagine, were also largely unsuccessful in Tampa. There was no mass conversion in Charlotte Harbor or Tampa Bay towards Christianity by Native Americans or indigenous people. However, Spain made significantly more progress with the natives in Tampa Bay than they had in Charlotte Harbor. And like any story of first contact with Europeans, that meant that Tampa Bay was hit devastatingly hard by European diseases that indigenous people had no defenses for. The Spaniards brought diseases like smallpox over from Europe, and the indigenous people of Tampa Bay were almost eradicated. And although Charlotte Harbor was affected by these, Tampa Bay was almost left completely depopulated when the Spanish left. And the Calusa happened to not be so lucky either. Although they had staved off the Spanish on their initial attempts to bring in Spanish colonization, the diseases as well as slave raids from British colonies in the Carolinas in order to try and get slave labor to the Carolinas devastated the Calusas. The Calusa actually managed to outlast the Spanish in Florida on their first attempt. In 1763, when Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain, Spain actually brought Calusa people to Havana, Cuba, to essentially guard them from the slave raids that were occurring on behalf of the British. We don't have much archaeological evidence for this or any written records, but it is very likely that Calusa people stayed behind and did not go with the Spanish. And so it's very likely that the Spanish were outlasted in Florida by the Calusa, and it is an astounding story of anti-colonial resistance, as well as just generally the devastation and just general harm that came about through first contact with Europeans. In fact, if you want an end credits scene for the Calusa, it's highly plausible that some of them managed to stay behind in Florida and integrate into what became the Seminole tribe of Indians in Florida, who would go on to carry on the struggle for indigenous independence in Florida and manage to beat the U.S. Army many, 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 many times. What does this have to do with the Tampa Bay Rays? That's probably the question you're asking. Well, the incentive structure that caused the Spanish to want to settle in Charlotte Harbor did not apply to the later British and eventually American settlers of Florida. Charlotte Harbor was significantly closer to Spain's possessions in the Caribbean, whereas Tampa Bay would be much closer to the British and eventually American settlements along the northern Gulf of Mexico and present day the Florida Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. These settlements were much more geared towards trade and shipments to Tampa than they were to Charlotte Harbor. So despite being geographically and environmentally so similar, the incentive structure for Charlotte Harbor for the British and Americans really just did not apply in the same way that it applied for the Spanish. However, in the event of a successful Spanish colonization of Charlotte Harbor, that settlement would have had a 300-year head start in terms of development on a settlement in Tampa Bay. The Ponce de Leon expedition was in 1521, and Tampa would not incorporate as a city under the Americans until 1849. That's a over 300-year head start that a settlement in Charlotte Harbor would have had. And in that event, that the settlement in Charlotte Harbor is already so big by the time the Americans gained control of Florida, it's very likely that that would have been the center of gravity on the Gulf Coast of Florida, especially the southwest coast. And so it's entirely possible that around the 1990s, MLB grants an expansion franchise to a settlement in Charlotte Harbor, here where the Rays do spring training, as opposed to Tampa Bay. Even after the fall of the Calusa in the 1760s, the southern part of the Florida Peninsula remained an intensely difficult place for European and eventually American settlers to wrangle. In 1763, Spain ceded Florida to Britain, which ruled the Florida Peninsula from 1763 to 1783, at which point it was transferred back to Spain, who until 1821 ruled the peninsula, at which point the United States officially gained control of Florida. After the fall of the Calusa, as well as the civilizations in Tampa Bay, the southern Gulf Coast experienced a significant decline in population, and that vacuum allowed for interesting new societies to develop, including the birth of the Seminole Nation of Indians, which dominated the Gulf Coast region, as well as many escaped slaves who had escaped bondage in the American South and formed their own plantations, their own farms, and their own communities in and around this area. After taking control of the peninsula in 1821, the United States almost immediately engaged in a campaign called the Seminole Wars. This was an attempt to dislodge the Seminole Indians from the southern part of Florida, as well as the newly escaped free blacks in this part of the state. The Seminole Wars were an absolute disaster for the United States. The inhospitable climate, the lack of preparation, disease-carrying insects, as well as a significant amount of deadly wildlife made this an absolutely horrific campaign for the United States Army. In our modern perception of Florida, Tampa is firmly in the center of the Florida Peninsula and not necessarily considered South Florida. But this is a very modern understanding of the geography in Florida. See, at the time of America's first acquisition of Florida in 1821 and first expansion into settlement further south in the state, Tampa was about as far south as you could go. Tampa at this time had more in common with frontier towns like Dodge City, Kansas, or Tombstone, Arizona, than it did with cities like Jacksonville and St. Augustine and Tallahassee further north in the state. This was the far south frontier. This was about as far as you could go before land became too treacherous, where the wildlife became too dangerous, as well as the natives even more inhospitable. By the time of Florida statehood in 1845, Tampa was still very much a marginal settlement on the far southern frontier. It did not help that in 1848, a massive hurricane blew through the Gulf Coast, destroying much of what had already been built in what is now Tampa. The survivors of that hurricane and those who chose to stay in 1849 officially incorporated Tampa as a city. Incorporation in 1849 would not mean the end of struggles for Tampa or Tampa Bay alone. In 1860, the Civil War breaks out, and the Union blockades southern ports, including Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is unable to export many of its goods. An overland route to northern rail lines in the north of Florida it was still a very arduous trek. There had not been a rail line constructed to Tampa. And even in the aftermath of the Civil War, from 1860 to 1880, Tampa was afflicted by a number of yellow fever outbreaks, which further reduced the population. This was as cursed of a city on the frontier as you could get. You had venomous animals, you had disease-carrying insects, you had yellow fever outbreaks, you had a hot, sweltering climate, and during the Civil War, merchants could not get goods out of Tampa Bay. It was a precarious time for Tampa Bay during this period, in that there was no guarantee that the large metropolitan area that we now call Tampa today and Tampa Bay would ever exist. By 1880, Tampa's population had dwindled down to a minuscule 720, down 20% from a decade prior. The Union's blockades, the lack of a rail route to northern cities and northern rail lines, as well as devastating yellow fever outbreaks, really put Tampa on the ropes. Everything would change in the 1880s, at which point rail connection finally reached Tampa. This meant that the plentiful fish, as well as newly found phosphorus in the area, could be transported by rail to northern ports and northern end users. This ultimately meant that goods did not have to only be transported by sea or by a very, very arduous and difficult overland trek to the rail lines. In 1885, Tampa finally gained a signature industry when Vicente Martinez Ybor moved his cigar operation from Key West to Tampa. Remember that name for later? The reason for this was simple: logistics. For Ybor, being in Key West meant that finished cigars would have to travel by sea to northern ports and end markets, which was not very logistically simple. When he moved to Tampa, finished cigars could move by rail, which was significantly less expensive as well as logistically simpler, rather than having to transport them by sea again. So this ultimately led to a massive influx of Cuban culture into Tampa far before Miami was ever founded. Although in our modern understanding, we typically associate Miami with Cuban culture in the state of Florida, Tampa was the progenitor of Cuban culture in Florida. Things like, obviously, Cuban cigars were brought over by Vicente Ybor when he came over to the United States and set up in Tampa. The Cuban sandwich was also invented in Tampa. These all happened in 1885, in the late 1880s. This was still over a decade from the Great Freeze when Miami first became a city. At this point, it was still a backwater port named Fort Dallas that was still looking for a rail connection and would not get it until the Florida East Coast Railway came down and built it after the Great Freeze. By the turn of the century, Tampa had completely transformed itself from a backwater port with only yellow fever to offer to a bustling city with a fast-growing cigar industry as well as a rapidly growing population of mainly Cuban and Italian immigrants, as well as people moving within the United States to Tampa. This was such a radical shift and set up a boom era for Tampa Bay. But before we discuss this next boom era in Tampa and why Tampa was a suitable city for Major League Baseball, I have a simple question to ask you. You want to buy some land in Florida? Throughout the 1900s into the 1910s, Tampa continued to grow as a city. The cigar industry continued to grow, the population continued to increase, and after some slight speed bumps in World War I, obviously due to the war effort, Tampa Bay entered the Roaring '20s in fashion. This was one of the popular cities in the United States, Tampa and Florida in general began to be advertised as a tourist destination, originally as a cure for diseases. Staying out of the cold northern winters and coming down to Florida was marketed really as a wellness cure for many people. And so Tampa began to grow and grow and grow. And along with that, across the entire state of Florida came land speculation and the land boom of Florida in the 1920s. This is where the sarcastic phrase, "I have some land in Florida to sell you," really originated from. People were buying land sight unseen with no guarantee of what they were actually buying during this time. I swear there were supposed to be houses here. The real estate agent told me that like all this land had already been cleared out already. That's really weird. There were billboards in New York and Chicago saying it's June in Miami right now. It's August in Tampa, and running in December in New York City and Boston and Chicago. And they were highly enticing. And this was an era without many consumer protections. And so Tampa, for the most part, was a part of this massive land boom of people buying land sight unseen. This is one of the many developments that's like this. They have fully platted out streets, property lines, and streets paved, and absolutely no one. There's not a soul here. And there's not a soul on the other side of this camera or down that street or down that street. There's nothing out here. It was all just built out, platted out, and sold to northern buyers. And that ended up catching up with the state of Florida. There were a number of companies, both on the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast, that engaged in these practices up and down the Florida Peninsula, south of really Orlando, where people were sold swampland. People were sold mosquito-infested, just miserable places. And if they came down, they would realize, oh my God, I've been conned. And people kind of made two decisions. They either were too ashamed to admit that they had been conned, or they tried to sell the land on or raise a fuss about it. But remember, this is pre-Great Depression. There are no consumer protections yet. And luckily for some of those landowners, consumer protections were on the way, because the Florida land boom eventually busted in a bad way. And many places in Florida were essentially permanently set back in their development by this bust. However, Tampa escaped from this fairly well. See, Tampa at this point was not a tourist destination. It was a manufacturing city. This was a city of people that came here to work, not necessarily just for leisure. There was certainly a leisure crowd, but there were plenty of people that lived in Tampa year-round, especially working in the cigar factory. So the fact that Ybor moved his cigar operation to Tampa kind of future-proofed Tampa against this bust. And the same way that Miami or St. Augustine would have been as well, or Naples, or Fort Myers. These were places that were hit hard by the land bust. Tampa was kind of guarded by having an actual industry in its town. So in an alternate timeline where, say, the Florida East Coast Railway finishes earlier and gets rail connection to Key West, Ybor doesn't move his cigar operation there. He stays in Key West. Tampa doesn't have a chance to grow. If Tampa doesn't have that existing industry and Tampa relies on tourism in the 1920s and 30s, then Tampa is set up for an economic bust in the Florida land bust after the boom. And so Tampa, and that's just the story of how all of this happened, is just this set of dominoes that fell in just the right order to make Tampa a fairly large city by the time of baseball expansion. This is a long history, and there's a lot of this that isn't about baseball, but to understand the Rays, you have to understand the specific order in which these dominoes fell, because without it, it's really hard to contextualize these things, because we don't get taught about it, because this Florida history, apart from being erased by maleficent forces right now, is just not really well taught. You know, like I was saying earlier, people kind of know there were Seminole Indians, then orange juice, air conditioning, and Disney World, and that's about it. And that is nowhere near the whole story. Plus, now that we're in the 1900s, we can officially begin to talk about baseball, because remember, this is a baseball video. So baseball began professionally in the Tampa Bay area, with the Chicago Cubs moving their spring training down to Plant Field in Tampa. And this would begin over a centuries-long relationship between northern teams coming down to the Tampa Bay area to do their spring training. Not long after, the Grapefruit League would be founded along with the Florida State League in 1919, with Tampa Bay hosting one of the original teams, the Tampa Smokers. Tampa would begin to be a haven for spring training, as it was a place popular with northern tourists, as well as people going on wellness trips to cure themselves of diseases down there at the time. And players coming down were very, very pleased by the hospitable climate during winter months. Around the same time baseball begins to move down south for spring training to Tampa, we also see the growth of a town across Tampa Bay from Tampa proper, St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg begins to host Major League Baseball spring training almost immediately after Tampa, and begins a centuries-long history of baseball spring training of their very own, setting us down the timeline that sees Major League Baseball in Tampa Bay, and specifically in St. Petersburg. Although this episode finishes around the 1930s, there's still a lot of history that has to occur between 1930 and the Tampa Bay Rays being inaugurated in 1998. And in the next episode, we get to talk about strange bedfellows, a Floridian's least favorite bird, and the wacky plan to try and save the Rays.